Welcome to Massey Dialogues. Bienvenue. My name is Nathalie Des Rosiers, and I'm the principal of Massey College. Massey College, where I live, is built on Indigenous land. The land inhabited by many Indigenous people over the centuries, the cherished land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward the land and the great privilege that we have to be here today. Because today we are talking about a famous radio show, CBC Ideas, which started as the best ideas you'll hear tonight. So our dialogue will be about the history of the show and also its current presence and personality. Ideas, the radio show, is also where the Massey lectures are broadcasted. So Massey community and Massey College has always been very interested in the show. So it's very important today to continue to celebrate this great show. And I am so delighted to have as my guest, Bernie Lucht, who was CBC radio producer for more than 40 years. Between 1984 and 2012, he was the executive producer of the CBC radio series Ideas and the CBC Massey Lectures. He's the member of the Order of Canada and a recipient of the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee, and he's also a senior fellow at Massey College. We will then be joined by Naheed Mustafa, who's an award-winning producer, writer, broadcaster. She began her career as a freelance reporter when she moved to Pakistan, where she worked for both the local English media and newspaper from Canada. When she came back to Canada, she was a writer, a researcher for documentary films. We know her well. And in 2000, she added broadcasting to her list of skills, and she became a regular documentary contributor at CBC Radio. And also, she is now a producer of news and current affairs at including Dispatches, As It Happens, The Current, and Ideas. And we'll also have Alex Sarra-Davis, who's a PhD student at University of Toronto in literature. He's a junior fellow at Massey College, and he has been, we just find out, a radio broadcaster as a student at UBC CITR radio station. So we'll be talking about radio today, and I am so delighted to have you all. So let's start with Bernie. Bernie, I think we want to hear about the real story behind Ideas.
Well, thank you, Natalie. I don't know if it's the real story, but it's my story, so it's part of it. For more than 5 decades, I've had an intimate relationship with a 4-letter word. That word was central to my professional life. I reflected on it, obsessed over it, I lost sleep over it. The word is idea. What is an idea? I start by turning to a few dictionaries, and here's part of what I find. Idea, a plan, thought, or suggestion, especially about what to do in a particular situation. Idea, a picture or an impression of in your mind of what someone or something is like. Idea, an opinion or a belief about something. Idea, the aim or purpose of something. Idea, whatever is known or supposed about something. Idea, a transcendent entity that is a real pattern of which existing things are imperfect representations. My own sense and the way I've thought about the show Ideas is that ideas are the myriad ways we explain the cosmos to ourselves. Observations, hypotheses, theories, analyses, interpretations, narrative stories. In short, how we think about everything and make sense of it. To generate ideas is to invoke that most luminous of human faculties, the imagination. Ideas was born as a program of adult education in 1965. It was the brainchild of two people: Phyllis Webb, a poet from British Columbia who wanted to work in radio. She had made her way east and joined the CBC in Toronto in 1964. Phyllis was assigned to produce a series of lecture programs called University of the Air. Her co-founder was Bill Young, an American who had come to Canada to study. In 1964, he was a graduate student of Marshall McLuhan at the University of Toronto. The CBC recruited him, and his first job was to produce a series called The Learning Stage, an adult education program with lectures and interviews about theater, film, music, poetry, and travel. Bill remembers attending a meeting at which the managers asked producers to consider amalgamating programs with similar mandates. The CBC needed to save money. Phyllis was enthusiastic about the idea. She felt the lecture format of her program was too narrow. She wanted to try something livelier. She and Bill worked together on a proposal to merge University of the Air and the Learning Stage. They suggested a new program that would take the best parts of each series and offer adult education on the radio using a variety of presentation styles. It would be broadcast 5 nights a week. CBC management accepted their proposal, and the new show went on the air in the fall of 1965. The first host was Ken Haslam, a distinguished and erudite CBC announcer. He had a rich, baritone voice, full of authority. To our ears today, the sound might be stiff and formal, but Haslam was perfect for the times, which demanded a certain formality in presentation. "Ideas," he boomed out. "The best ideas you'll hear tonight." It was Monday, October 25th, 1965. Haslam described the new series as the new look in educational broadcasting, an hour-long show every night of the week of, quote, radio for the mind. "Idea number one for Monday," he said, "Charles Darwin's theory of evolution." And so the series was launched. Phyllis and Bill hired a third person to work with them, a young woman named Janet Somerville. Janet had been working on her master's degree in theology at the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto. When she learned of the vacancy at Ideas, she jumped at it and applied. She didn't expect to get the job and was taken by surprise when she was hired. She was the first Ideas producer. The program also had a roster of freelance contributors. The best known was Timothy Findlay, the novelist, who was the show's literary editor. His partner, Bill Whitehead, was the science editor. Phyllis Webb told me she was disappointed by that first show. She said the series got off to a horrible start. Janet said it was classroomy and textbookish, but this new series eventually found its feet. I joined the show in September 1971. I was 27 years old and had just returned home from working 2 years as a volunteer teacher in a remote mountain village in northeastern Nigeria. I came to the job with a bachelor's degree in political science and history, 2 years of producing news magazines for Radio Canada International, and a season of producing cross-country checkup. I had done this before quitting the CBC to have an adventure in Africa. I had no formal training in broadcasting, didn't know much about what I was doing, and was about to embark on a course of on-the-job training that would last for many years. My first assignment was to edit the raw recordings of that year's Massey lecturer, James A. Corey. Corey was the most prominent Canadian political scientist of the day. He was the principal of Queen's University and had written a standard text called Democratic Government and Politics. It was used in university political science courses across Canada. The title of his lectures was The Power of the Law. The lectures were recorded on quarter-inch audio tape. I was handed a pile of large tape reels and told to edit them into 5 30-minute lectures. Today, we work in digital media. Complex editing is done in seconds with the drag and click of a mouse. Back then, we edited on audio tape. The tape ran past the playhead of a tape recorder. To make an edit, you stopped the tape, marked the edit point with a grease pencil, and cut the tape with a razor blade. I started to listen to Professor Corey. The first thing that struck me is that he spoke very, very slowly. There were long pauses between his words. I remember thinking, this won't work. We can't put someone speaking this slowly on the radio. What to do? I decided to speed him up. But how? I would cut the pauses between his words using a grease pencil and a razor blade for every edit. Thousands of edits later, I got it done. And a few weeks after that, the lectures went on the air. The audience liked them. Some listeners had been Professor Corey's students. They had taken his courses at university. I received several letters saying, "We really enjoyed Professor Corey's Massey lectures, but we never heard him speak so fast." From its beginning in 1965 and through the 1970s, Ideas gave thorough and extensive coverage of the topics it treated. A thematic series might be 20 episodes or more, running 5 nights a week for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, or 6 weeks. There were shorter series as well. One year, we devoted the entire month of October to exploring the topic of fate, F-A-T-E, fate. There was a variety of presentations in the series, commissioned lectures, interviews, documentaries, and panel discussions. Ideas projects were collaborations between the producers on the show and a variety of contributors, university professors, writers, freelance writer broadcasters. I had had an amateur interest in astronomy and wanted to produce a series of radio documentaries about it. This was in the mid-1970s. I put out the word to my friends and colleagues that I was looking for someone to work with. A science fiction writer and editor named Judith Merrill came up and said, "I have just the person." "Who?" I asked. "His name is John Lomberg," she said. "I've never heard of him. What does he do?" "He's an astronomical artist. He specializes in painting galaxies. I'll invite him to have lunch with us next week." The day for the lunch came. It was a treat. John was easy to talk to, and we hit it off. He was open, articulate, smart, energetic, and really interested in working on a radio series about astronomy. I was thrilled. He said, "I've got a friend who may be able to help us." "Who's that?" I asked. "His name is Carl Sagan. He teaches astronomy at Cornell University. He's coming to town in 2 weeks. I'll arrange for us to have dinner." We met Sagan on an early spring evening in 1975 at a Japanese restaurant on Church Street called Nishi. He was interested in the project and encouraged us, but said he couldn't do any work on it himself. He agreed to be interviewed at length and said he'd be happy to open doors to people who could help. So we got started. I put John through the basic training ideas producers did with all new freelancers. What is a tape recorder? What is a microphone? What buttons do I push? John collected interviews in the weeks and months that followed. We would check in with each other periodically to see how things were going. Then came a day, a few months later, when that phase of the work was done. The interviews, the sound gathering, the location visits to labs and observatories. We now had to put the shows together. I gave John the next part of the training, how to edit audio and how to set up a script. 2 weeks later, John phoned and said he had a rough cut of the first episode. I trooped out to his small apartment on Keele Street and went into his workroom. His desk was strewn with reels of tape, typed sheets of paper, and bits of handwritten notes. In front of him were a tape recorder and typewriter. He gave me a copy of the script, set up the first clip on the recorder, and pressed play. Right away, I thought, this is not a good way to start. I told John to stop the playback. "You can't begin like that," I said. He looked at me. "John, why not?" "Me, it doesn't work." "John, what do you mean it doesn't work?" "Me, I don't know what I mean. It just doesn't work." We went back and forth a few times. He was persistent. He wanted to know why I thought the opening didn't work. I didn't know what to say. I just knew intuitively that it didn't. I had never encountered such resistance before. I thought to myself, we have 6-hour-long episodes to make. We have 6 months to make them. We're only in the first 30 seconds and already we're bogged down. We'll never finish if things keep going like this. "I want to propose a deal," I said to John. "What deal?" he said, suspicious. "The deal is this. I tell you something doesn't work. We figure out how to fix it. You agree, and we do it." He looked doubtful. I knew I had to offer him something. "Here's my part of the deal," I said. "At the end of the day, I go home. I scratch my head, and I figure out why something didn't work. I commit to telling you why the next day." So I went home that night and thought about that opening clip. Why didn't it work? I thought and decided it was too abstract, too general. You needed something more concrete, an image or a story. I told John this when we got together the next day. He agreed, and we moved on from there. And so the work proceeded, day after day, for 6 months. We worked through dozens of issues. Maybe a clip was too long. Maybe it was unfocused. Maybe the rhythm was wrong, or the sound was bad. And so it went until we finished. For me personally, there was an epiphany. By having to explain to John why something didn't work, I figured out the syntax of radio documentary. My intuitive understanding had already been there. Now I had the analysis as well. Our series was called Into the Universe. It was broadcast over 6 weeks in the fall of 1976. Carl Sagan was the major interviewee. The series preceded the PBS television series Cosmos, launched 4 years later in 1980, hosted by Sagan. John was chief artist and designed most of the animation sequences. Time passes. When the job of executive producer of Ideas opened up in 1984, I presented myself as a candidate. CBC management thought the show was too academic, and it was in some danger. The senior managers who interviewed me asked, does something have to be boring in order to be true?
So the power of narrative, that's what you discovered. All academics know that. You need to have a hook. You need to have a narrative to explain your ideas. So this is so wonderful. Well, let me bring in Naheed. Thank you for this wonderful look at the history and all these good anecdotes. Naheed, what's happening to ideas now? Do you have trouble with your people? Do they listen to you, or do you have to explore the views of narratives? So
I'm going to say all of the above, but also that's the nature of the beast, right? I mean, that's just how it goes. I also want to say thank you to Bernie for laying out that history. I'm a relatively new addition to the Ideas team. I joined up in I did my first contribution in 2014, and I came on board as a producer in 2017. And so it's and the show itself has been going through some changes and some transformations. And so it's always important to remind ourselves of where we came from, so that we can think better about where we want to head. The challenge I find for the show right now, the sort of the complexity of engaging with academic knowledge and with academics, because we do interview a lot of academics, that challenge is still there. But I find that there are a lot of younger scholars and some older scholars too, but there is a sort of a keener desire, I think, among academics to be in that space where they're able to talk about their work in a way that the ordinary person can kind of consume it and understand it. And, ideas, I think a lot of us that work at the show, we do see ourselves in some way as a kind of vehicle for those public discussions and for public discourse. And so it's always important to be able to bring people into that space. And so that's kind of where we are right now, and sort of thinking about what does a show with this long legacy, what does it need to do and sound like in a modern context where the space is very busy and there is a lot of challenge and there is a lot of content out there. And so what are we bringing to the table in that sense?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you is, I mean, it has a name, it has a brand, for a long time, but it needs to constantly be current, it needs to constantly be relevant to 2021. So that's also a little bit Massey College's dilemma, strong brand, but wanting to continue to be relevant and relevant to the world of today. So any tips or any thoughts is that what you're worried about in the team at Ideas?
I think that the challenge of relevance is always going to be there for anybody that's undertaking any kind of creative work, whether that's creative in the sense of producing programming, or it's creative in the sense of thinking about big ideas in the way that academics do, that is also a form of creation. And so I personally have a bit of a kind of a complicated relationship with the term relevance. I think that people sometimes think of relevant in the sense of like what relates to me personally, and I think that that's too narrow of an understanding of that term. At the same time, I think it's important not to let yourself be held hostage to the idea of relevance, because that can also sweep away a lot of the broader things that you might want to talk about, or about topics that people, the way we talk about things that you need to know but may not really care to know, which is always a challenge. But I think that, that is something that we come up against. There are a lot of topics that people talk about today, a lot of issues that are ongoing today, whether it's, race issues or gender, or in the way that we talk about intersectionality. Does that mean that in order to talk about those things, we should stop talking about other things? And I don't think that should be the case. I think that we still need to make sure that the shows that we're bringing to the fore at Ideas are diverse in their history, but also in, that the scope is wide. I don't want to sort of limit ourselves to kind of a very current affairs model where we're sort of attaching ourselves to the news of the day. I think that really runs against what Ideas wants to be doing.
Go ahead, Bernie.
Oh, thanks, Natalie. Naheed, I don't know if it's the case now, but when I was there for a long time, I was often asked by supervisory people, why don't you do more about what's in the news? And so it seemed to me that relevance was to some extent defined by what's in the news. And I would always say, you have lots of shows that are expert the next day in producing background, that what we have is somewhat of a longer view, and we may be able to address things in 6 months or a year when we know more about an issue that we really don't have anything to add to now. So I like to expand the meaning of relevance, which really has to do with the nature of contemporary thought and what people are interested, that goes well beyond what's in the news, which I think gives quite a small view on the world.
For sure. And I think one of the things, sorry, Natalie, just to interject, I think one of the things that is more important, well, I don't want to say more important, but one of the things that has changed is the idea of what kinds of knowledge constitute relevance. So, for a long time, the show was very much about a kind of like, the Western canon and a sort of a Western literary history or a Western political history, even if we're talking about philosophy or any of those things. And now it's important to sort of see, what does the bigger puzzle look like? What is the larger conversation? How to bring in voices that we might think of as voices from the margin, but really round out and fill out those gaps. As a recent guest put on, he said on one of the shows that I recently produced, he said that, just talking to one type of person about one version of the history, that's propaganda. That's not really giving a sort of a fulsome picture of what's happened and how we've come to be where we are. And so that's also relevant, right? Like, that's what I mean by expanding the idea of what is relevant. It can't just be super zeitgeisty and what's happening right now. We have to bring in a lot of voices and build a bigger picture.
So let's hear from Alex then, the young scholar. Alex, first of all, you will know how to use narrative to explain your ideas when you want to speak on radio. But what do you expect as a young scholar from radio shows like Ideas?
I definitely think that one of the interesting things that's changed about higher education, though, admittedly, this is just from my perspective, a lot of my peers are very interested in communicating their ideas. So science communication is a topic that is taught, I think, much more widely and in depth than it was in previous decades, which I think leads to this kind of interest about, grappling with these sorts of issues that Naheed and Bernie have already started to bring up when it comes to things like relevance and equity and appropriateness for online conversation. How do you balance needing to get a multiplicity of voices, but also make sure that you're giving voices to folks who haven't always been given the opportunity to speak? How do you make sure that you provide relevant information or relevant ideas while also not falling into the trap of moving too quickly and hastily? How do you make sure that you're preserving the freedom of expression and of ideas, but also not giving a platform to harmful ideas or things that, you know, can't be debated in a kind of intellectual way. And I think these are a lot of the same concerns that people are dealing with, whether they are academics coming up now or, you know, people trying to put together a radio show. And so I would be interested to hear from Bernie or Naheed how those sorts of tensions came through in their time working with ideas, and what sort of solutions, or if there were particular instances that come to mind when I mention these problems.
One of the things that I find interesting, I had an opportunity over my time at the show to, you know, the 40th and I think 50th anniversary passed when I was still there. And I went back through many of the show's archives. And what fascinated me, looking into the past from, say, the mid-1980s, and looking into the future from there and looking into the current, is how many of the things we talked about were similar concerns across time. You know, before the fall of the Soviet Union, nuclear war was a big concern for people, potential. The environment was always a big concern. We talked about it all the time. The tension between private and public in our lives, in governance, was a tension we talked about. I find so many areas where the ongoing human concerns are the same, though the players are always changing. And of course, now the discussion is truly global in a way it wasn't 40 years ago, and the technology has given us that capability in a way that didn't before. You know, nothing in the globe is far away from us now, but 30 and 40 years ago, it was far away, and you paid less attention to it because it was far away. But now it's right there. It's on your screen, and people are all over the place. And so nothing is far. So one looks at the globe in a very different way.
Is it true, though? Is it true, Naheed, that the audience is able and sees itself as citizens of the world, as opposed to, you know, wanting information that's relevant to my situations right now, today in Canada, in Toronto? Although Ideas has always had an audience that was way broader than just Canada, if I remember.
And we're broadcast beyond Canada as well, and obviously with the internet, you can be anywhere. And I think that question about what do audiences want, I mean, if anybody can come up with a definitive answer, then they will, you know, rule the world. I think, I mean, to go back to Alex's question about the ways in which we grapple with these questions about, you know, whose voice, when, and how, you know, which ideas to engage with and which ideas, how do we deem what is harmful? I mean, obviously at the CBC, you know, we have a journalistic standards of practice, the document, which sort of outlines editorially what's in and what's out, and why we think of that way. It's a document about the principles of the editorial principles we work by. As far as the show goes, though, I mean, we're a fairly small team. And so there's a lot of discussion that does happen from time to time when something particularly contentious comes our way, potentially, or a contentious speaker, someone who's controversial, or people that are out there today who have a reputation or a certain kind of notoriety, excuse me, you know, do they belong on Ideas? And I think that is a difficult grappling, right? Because, I mean, for me as a producer, the way that I approach my work, and this is not to say it's exclusive in any way, I'm sure lots of people do this, but I can only speak for myself, is I try to think about, like, what's the project? Like, what's the goal here? What is the project that I am trying to work on? Not just narratively and not just in terms of who's there, but like, what's the bigger meaning of this? Which can be exhausting sometimes to have to go through that process with everything, but I tend to overthink a lot. And for me, it's, I mean, at the end of the day, I am in some position to say what I personally think is productive conversation and what I personally think is harmful conversation. And that's a challenge, right? Because, you know, in some sense, who am I to decide what is productive and what is harmful and what is useful and what is not? But I don't know that there's any other way forward. You know, without, and is it censorious? Is it some way of limiting people? Possibly, but I also try to think about what other avenues people have for getting their ideas out there. Are these people who already have vast platforms and opportunities and spaces they inhabit? Do they need to be on ideas as well? You know, and is it an idea that's controversial because it's new and pushing back and offering something interesting, or is it controversial because it's merely there to tear down what preceded it? That is also a way to grapple with that question. I don't know that that's a good answer, but that's just kind of where I am right now, and I know that a lot of other producers at the show, which it can be challenging, right? Because we sort of work on our own, and we have this vast amount of time at a show that's got some icon value, and you know, and so how do we take on that responsibility? And I think that that's an ongoing conversation for the program and for the people that work there.
I was struck when Bernie was talking about the 6-month investment of time in designing the series on the astronomy. It seemed so worthwhile. I mean, it's so close to the way academics work, you know, like we need the time to go deep. Alex knows about that, you know, you need the time to go deep and explore all the avenues so that you're sure that you've read everything that should be read before you say something. But is that only something that a public broadcaster can do? And is it still possible, Naheed, to continue to have these long-term projects? I was struck as well when Bernie said, oh, at the beginning it started because CBC wanted to save money. It sounded familiar as well. So what about you, Naheed? What's the current situation now?
Well, the money question is always on the table. I don't think it's ever not been on the table. I think that it's less possible to do those major projects where you can go away for 8 months and work on one single thing and then unveil these beautifully produced 8 episodes looking very deeply and in a long way at a single you know, topic. That happens much less often now. I mean, it hasn't happened at all under my, you know, in the time that I've been there. And a lot of that is attributable to budget cuts, but a lot of that is also attributable, I think, to what people want to do. I mean, one of the challenges, I think, is, you know, there's a lot of information out there. People have a lot of places to go to learn things. And, you know, ideas isn't the only place that people are looking to for these in-depth treatments. You know, podcasting is as vast as it is niche in terms of what podcasts offer up. I think, you know, knowledge sharing has very, you know, it's very democratic now. If you look at the kind of scholarship and theorizing happening on Twitter, for example, it's amazing and brilliant, and you know, and it's very fast paced, which can present its own problems, but there are a lot of places for people to go. And so is there an appetite for someone to listen to 8 or 10 episodes on a single topic? Possibly, but is there time for individual producers to do that? I don't think so. You know, and I think that, you know, that there's also the idea of, you know, are we here, like, what's our job here? Is our job to kind of offer up ways for people to think about things, or is our job to educate people? And I don't like to think about my job as being something to educate people. I feel like that's very paternalistic, even though that's where the show may have started in its early days. But I don't think producers think of themselves as educators. We kind of think of ourselves, I think, as facilitators of conversation. And hopefully the people that are involved in that conversation know what they're talking about, because, you know, we need to have a trust factor there. But I think that might be one of the ways that the show has kind of changed, is that there's a sense that we are among, you know, we're sort of part of the conversation and not the only. But just the last point in terms of your question around public radio, I think that Canada and Canadians really need to have a serious conversation about what they want from a public broadcaster and what a public broadcaster ought to be doing. And I know that I have a vested interest here, but I think that the role of a public broadcaster is profoundly philosophically different than the role of a private broadcaster. And, you know, you can ask somebody in private media, who's your audience? But if you ask somebody in public broadcasting, the answer literally has to be, according to our mandate, every single Canadian out there. And so how do you program for every single Canadian out there? And so I think that it's really important for us to have as much diverse, you know, programming as we can. And Ideas is an amazing place to be able to do that, because you are given this time and space and opportunity to create conversations. So that's what, and I think it can only be something that survives on public radio. I don't think this is something that would really hold any interest for the privates.
But that's what I thought too. So Alex, I mean, you're a young voter and you're a young taxpayer. So what do you expect from public radio? You know, you're going to be an educator, a leader in your field, and is there a role for you? Are the young scholars eager to keep public radio, and what does it mean to them, do you think?
I think that as with any generation, there's certainly a wide range of political stances when it comes to public radio and public investments in media in general. I know that I probably lean towards the center of where a lot of university or grad school educated folks land when it comes to public radio, which is that it is a good. It's a public good. It's a resource. It's an opportunity for projects that are longer term, that maybe aren't quite as profitable, but certainly might still appeal to wide audiences, especially within kind of national boundaries. I love listening to CBC Radio 1. I know a lot of my peers do as well. But equally, I know that there are a lot of challenges to be faced when it comes to these big sorts of questions that people ask. And certainly some of those people are young people like myself. Those questions like, well, is this content that's being provided by a government subject to government political agendas? Is this information being presented to me subject to, you know, intellectual elitism or exclusivity, or kind of, is it work that only serves to shore up existing positions of power? And those questions are asked by people on both sides of the political spectrum. So I guess a question that I have for both of you, but I might like to start with Bernie, because I would be interested to know if this also applied during his time with the program, is how do you respond when you're working on a program like CBC Ideas, which is so transparently about sharing ideas and kind of broader ideas of education and new concepts and things. If something is explicitly about education and sharing those messages and those ideas, how do you deal with the trend of kind of anti-intellectualism, or the trend of criticizing academic, for instance, elitism when it comes to, you know, what constitutes a good idea or an articulated phrase?
Well, you know, the ideas we put on the show emerged from quite a wide community that had at its core the staff of the show. There were about 10 people, and then a large community of freelance contributors who would pitch things to the show every year, and we talk about them. And you try to make some decisions about what you did based on our collective sense of what was resonant. Resonance was a word I started to use to talk about the show rather than relevance, because I remember feeling the word relevance was always coming up. And I thought it feels like such a corporate word, and I bridled against corporate language. And so I started to talk about resonance, which seemed to me a deeper possibility, in that in the way that poetry is resonant or literature is resonant, you encounter it and it strikes a chord within you that possibly you didn't even know was there. So I was looking for resonance in all kinds of areas. And how do you discover what it is? Well, I always felt by trying to be in touch with the culture as best you can, by reaching out as widely as you can to find out what's on people's minds. Um, you know, we didn't do surveys. What do you want? I remember the editor of the New Yorker, David Remnick, years ago, said something like, he wrote this in a piece in the New Yorker, that to ask an audience what they want is insanity. It's a little bit like the head of Steve Jobs would say, the audience doesn't know what we want. We know what they want.
Know what they want.
That it and you know, many of these judgments turned out to be quite right about that. So for me, what I came to the job out of a life of intellectual wonder at many, many things in the world, in society, in the cosmos. And that's what drove me personally, wonder. And we tried in the range of the show to where all of us brought the wonder we felt to making the show and to the decisions we made on the show. And, you know, I did it for a long time. Each year, when we finished the year, we never knew if we could do it another year. It went on for a long time. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
So Naheed,
if I could just pick up on that. Like, I mean, one of the sort of the places to start with is that, you know, Ideas is a very heavily producer-driven show. There isn't a strong top-down mandate. The show is really every program is the brainchild of an individual producer. And so any program anywhere is going to be a reflection of who's working there. And we know this. I mean, we know this is a basic fact of equity, that you know, what we have in front of our face is a reflection of who is building that space. And it's the same with the kind of ideas that make their way onto Ideas, is that they are a reflection of the people that are in that space generating those ideas. And I think that sometimes, you know, it's sort of like that old sort of adage, you know, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, or however that works. But, you know, one man's intellectual is another man's iconoclast. And I think that, you know, ideas themselves go through these cycles of ascendancy and pushback and, you know, and then regeneration. And so where do you find yourself in that cycle of the life cycle of an idea? And, you know, if you find yourself at one point, you may be, you know, sort of boosting the propaganda, but if you find yourself at another point, you may be on, you know, the cusp of a new wave of thinking. And so I think that that's part of the challenge. When you talk about anti-intellectualism, I think I know what you mean specifically, but I also want to think that that is also a term that's very contextual, right? Whose intellectualism are we against, and what ideas are we pushing against? If it's an idea that, you know, sort of this populism that's out there, that's kind of like a dumb populism, if you want to use that term, where it's just the purpose of it is to merely tear down and not to offer anything new, which we tend to see more as a political phenomenon, but maybe it's existing in the academy as well. I don't know. I'm not in that space. I think that ends up us having those discussions based on our conversations with the people that we trust, who are out there, who can help sort of guide us in some ways, to get a better handle on, you know, the question of, is this a valid pushback, or is this a pushback that, you know, that's gaining credibility because people are angry about something else? And this happens in the academy as well.
Yes.
I mean, it's a hard thing to answer, because it's also very organic and in the moment, right? Like, one of the things I like to do is I'll just give a quick example. I know we're coming up on the end of time here, but I did a program some years back called looking at a text called Hayy ibn Yaqzan, written by a 12th century philosopher, and everybody was like a philosopher doctor in the day, I guess. And he was an Andalusian, and he writes this text, and it's really about there's a bunch of themes running through it, and he wrote it really as a kind of story to marry both religion with philosophy. As a way to kind of, grapple with this tension in his own time between, orthodoxy and this idea that philosophy had a place in religion as well. And that text has moved over time and through space and been taken up in various ways over the centuries, and ultimately found its way into some of the early English Enlightenment conversations. The ideas of autodidactism and self-learning and using your senses and empiricism and all of that kind of thing. And to me, sure, we're invoking, the Johns, Locke, Rousseau, and we're sort of invoking them, but we're also talking about a longer heritage, an intellectual debt, and an intellectual legacy. And that's one way to kind of, I think, marry some of these problems of, instead of necessarily just hammering at Enlightenment values as something that's kind of led us to this terrible moment that we're in, why not talk about where those values, trace their own origins to. And maybe we're not offering any answers, but we're certainly offering a longer history that allows people to grapple with the bigger questions. And maybe that's the job of this program, is to just open up more questions and not really to offer many answers. And that's okay too, I think. That's
so here, a question that Bernie and Naheed, which episode sticks out to you that you didn't expect to stay with you, and why? I mean, the last one, I love, Naheed, this story, but any episode, let's start with Naheed. What another episode that sticks with you, that continues to be on, that resonated with you, as we call it, about resonance?
Well, if it's one of my shows, one of my shows that sort of I really, really love doing. I did a program some years ago looking at the ethics of drone warfare, and having a conversation about whether, the reason that I liked it was it sort of, the first half of it was a short documentary interview that I produced in the field, a man whose son and his brother were killed in an American drone strike. So for me, that's one of my own. But I mean, in terms of things that have been produced over time, but also by my colleagues, I mean, just a phenomenal number of them. I personally love really quirky things, and I don't do quirky well. I'm not very good at it, but I have colleagues that do quirky really, really well, in a way that really brings the kind of the joy and the wonder of certain topics to the fore. I would say that there was an episode, it was actually a series that was done on secularism. It was like a 6 or 8 part series. I thought that was brilliant. It was really, really good. And then also there was an episode that was actually just recently done by a colleague of mine, Lisa Godfrey, who is actually also a former Southern Fellow, on how to live together. We've done this series on what is the common good, and she'd done one about ways of living together that just presented a variety of ideas about how do we learn to live together given the various crises that we're facing, environmental and housing and all of those things. And I think that was an example of what Ideas does really well, is to put forward a set of questions and a set of opportunities to think through potential answers. So yeah, those would be 2 things I would talk about.
And Bernie, what was the show that resonated with you?
Boy, there are so many. I never know how to answer that kind of question, but I will talk about one Massey lecture. I could talk about many others too, and that was the Massey lecture series that were done by Margaret Atwood on debt. And these lectures were planned years in advance, several years in advance, and there was a change in the year they were supposed to go on. Originally, she was supposed to do them in 2009, and her publisher, she had a novel that was to come out in 2008, and it was the year of the election of Barack Obama. And her publisher said, we are going to delay your book, your novel, to 2009, when she's also supposed to do the Massey lecture. So we thought what to do. 2 books by Margaret Atwood at the same time, it won't work. So we prevailed on her to do something you would never ask a writer to do. Can you give us your lecture a year early? So we met in the master's office at Massey College and made the case. And she said, that makes sense. She said, I can do it if you give me 2 researchers. I have 10 weeks. So she wrote these lectures on debt, and they were launched in the fall of 2008, the same time the economy fell off the cliff. There was a kind of prophecy there. That has always stuck with me.
That's true. Alex, what's your next project, and what would you pitch as an idea for the show ideas? What do you think?
I think that's a super interesting. I think that's a super interesting question. I'm not going to talk too much about my own next project because it's pretty different. I'm a student of literature, but one of the questions that I know is kind of taking over the financial world right now is the question of how does a financial institution's fiduciary duty, how does that extend beyond the limits of what they owe their stakeholders in terms of returns? And, there are all of these new ideas out there about social responsibilities and environmental responsibilities. And so I would be really interested to see an ideas episode that tackled something along there. Though I have to confess, if you've already done that, I apologize.
You should pitch us. Pitch that idea.
So we're coming to the we're coming to the end of our show. So usually I ask people to just, what do you want our audience to remember from this broad look at the history of a fabulous radio program? A couple of things that our audience should remember about today's dialogue. Let's start with Bernie.
Oh my goodness! I used to say when people listen to ideas, I wanted them to doubt what they already believed up to that point. I wanted to induce doubt. Today, I wanted to tell part of the story of a program. I hope they're entertained by it and that it gives a perspective, because this story hasn't been told so often, that they didn't know before. So that's as far as it goes with me.
That sounds wonderful. Naheed?
I would want people to know, and I hope it came across in this conversation, that Ideas it's got this long history, but it remains a very dynamic program. And it's not just a look back. It is mostly a look forward. And so I think that it's really, it's something that will, to use Bernie's word, resonate, I think, in a way that people will, often people are surprised by, to find out how relevant and of the moment the programming is, even though it does take the long and broad view on things.
Yes, and Alex.
I would just say, I would just say that when I was a kid, and even now, I really loved the program Quirks and Quarks. And I was always so disappointed that it was only 30 minutes. And it wasn't until I volunteered at campus and community radio stations as an undergrad that I realized just how much time, effort, money, everything goes into producing even 15 minutes of content for the radio. And to really encourage people to remember how many hours are on the cutting room floor in terms of interviews, and how many hours of script editing and editing goes into just the 1 hour segments on Ideas.
Yes, and I think we know that Ideas is for curiosity, and that's we want to foster a continued reflections on how important to continue to doubt, to questions, and to be present to one's world. So I want to thank you all for being here and doing such a wonderful program on ideas. We want to go and continue to watch it and continue to be partners in the Massey Lectures, for sure. I also want to thank our own production team at Massey College, our amateur. I have to say we were all very stressed out today because here we are, this amateur little group speaking to the specialist of good production. So thank you to Matt Renfield and to Elisa Gainsbourg. And for Bernie, I want to say that one of our next dialogue will be about astrophysics. So I think you may enjoy listening to The Future is in the Stars, the future astrophysics. So thank you all for being here. It was wonderful to talk about ideas.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.